Welcome back to the Azure Education video series. This is video number 7, focusing on role-based access. My name is David Ulloa, Azure TSP. I'm joined by Amy Manley and Eric DeBoard, also Azure TSPs at Microsoft, and we focus in education. Let's go ahead and get started. So let's review Contoso. In our previous video, video number 6 in the series, Contoso got a better understanding of cost spend by creating estimates and using tools to monitor spend over time, as well as leveraging some optimizations. In this video, Contoso will define access management for cloud resources. To get started, Contoso Education wants to make sure that they're following some security best practices for locking down access in Azure. So some of the things we'll be taking a look today is what needs to be set up in place so that when people lose access when they leave the institution. We also want to leverage multi-factor authentication. So we're going to take a look at how that could be enabled, and also set up minimum access for what's needed to do day-to-day work. Okay, so what is Azure ID Connect? So Azure ID Connect is what allows on-prem identities to synchronize to Azure Active Directory. If you recall, most of our education customers are already Office 365 customers, so they already have this service in place. As identities get provisioned on premises, whether it's through an identity management system, those identities get synchronized and provisioned in Azure Active Directory. And by the same token, if those identities are disabled or somebody leaves the institution, then that in turn disables or removes those identities in Azure Active Directory. And those same identities are what we're going to be leveraging to log into the Azure Portal, whether it's infrastructure as a service or platform as a service. So one of the security best practices is having Azure AD Connect in place so that the same identity processes that are in place continue to replicate to Azure and identities get disabled following best practices.
And something I'll add here, David, is that, with Azure AD, it's very easy to enable multi-factor authentication. That's obviously an important tool for managing the cloud, since by its nature, it's accessible from anywhere in the world. In addition to that MFA, we have what is known as conditional access. That's a capability of Azure AD that says, oh, these people can log in from on-campus IPs only, and we're still going to challenge them with MFA. So there's a lot of different ways we can control access with Azure AD.
Yeah, no, excellent point, Eric. And again, most folks are already have this foundational service already in place. But if you don't, you can go ahead and just right there in the bottom right-hand corner, it provides step-by-step Azure AD Connect tool. And we're also going to place some of these links in the video notes when this video is uploaded. Okay, another security best practice that Contoso wants to follow is using multi-factor authentication, especially for owner accounts, permissions. Those accounts that have owner permissions to your Azure subscription. You notice here, this is one of these alerts that are visible in Azure Security Center, recommending to those Azure administrators that to improve their security score, it's recommended that you enable MFA. So let's go ahead and show you that in the Azure Portal, where that recommendation here is. So I'm going to log in here. Now you're seeing the Azure Portal. I'm going to go here to Security Center. And by the way, the recommendations in Security Center, it's at no cost. So this is one of those free services that you can leverage for the base recommendations. And I'm going to click here where it says Identity and Access. And you're going to notice under these recommendations, the first one, it says Enable MFA for accounts with owner permissions. You're going to click on that. And it's going to provide you a link. First, it's going to tell you which are the subscriptions that meet that requirement. They're owner access, but they don't have MFA. And you'll see here the remediation steps that you can click on, and it'll walk you step by step of how to enable MFA for those accounts. In fact, I have here a different subscription, which I'm going to show you. So I'm going to go ahead and just show you here. This is an Azure subscription. To do this, you go to Azure Active Directory. Again, you're going to need to have enough rights to be able to enable multi-factor authentication. So I clicked on all users. You notice here in this middle blade here, you have the option to enable multi-factor authentication. Click on that. It's going to pop up another window where if you have enough permissions and you have the right licensing, you can go ahead and just select that account and just click enable to enable multi-factor authentication. And then you also notice here there's a deployment guide. So if you want more information about enabling and all the steps that's required, just click on that multi-factor auth deployment guide and you'll get to see additional details for deploying MFA in your organization.
And important point to make here too, David, is that our education customers get Azure AD Basic for free. Azure AD Basic doesn't include multi-factor authentication, but the reason I'm bringing this up is that you don't have to get premium for every single employee. You can decide just to get the premium Azure AD for the group of people who are going to be accessing and managing Azure, and so that they're protected with MFA, not just everyone.
Yeah, great point, Eric. Yeah, ideally you want to have everyone, right? Everyone in the institution leveraging MFA, but like you said, if you don't have the requirement to enable MFA for the whole institution, at the very minimum, just like we saw here in the recommendation, at the very minimum, enable MFA for those accounts that have owner permissions on your Azure subscriptions. All right. So the next kind of like best practice that Contoso wants to follow is to enable role-based access control in Azure. So in Azure, you have this fine-grained access control that you can grant access by assigning, whether it's a user or a group, a specific role. It could be done at the subscription level, it could be done at the resource group level. And again, resource group, like we may have mentioned before, resource group is just a container that is associated with multiple resources. And then you can assign permissions at that level. And also you can assign permissions at the actual resource level. So it could be a virtual machine, it could be a SQL database. You can define those permissions. And then the other part is you can define, you can use built-in roles. So some examples of the top level roles could be an owner, and that could be granted at the subscription level to have access pretty much to all the resources in that subscription. You also have another top level role called contributor, and that has access to pretty much all the resources except change permissions. So we're going to go ahead and show you some of those demos.
And I just to chime in here, David, I think one good way to think about this for those who have been in IT for a while is to think about file permissions. So you could think of the subscription as maybe the C drive, a resource group or resource groups as folders, and then this final tier at the bottom, the actual resource, you can think of that as a file. So you can assign permissions at the upper level that gets inherited down the list, or you can assign permissions just to the specific resources that you want to give access to.
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. And that's exactly the last point, is assignments that are inherited down the resource hierarchy. So at the top level, if you define owners, then all the resources underneath that subscription will inherit that owner access. So, and we'll show folks in the portal how to do that. Okay, so here we have some links, and we'll provide these in the video's notes. More information about roles and role-based access in Azure. Again, there's many different built-in roles that you can leverage. It's kind of like the top level common ones are the owner, contributor, and reader access, and those are the more typical ones that are used. But be aware that there's very resource-specific admin roles. Some examples are virtual machine contributor, or maybe a SQL database contributor, Or for Contoso, one of the scenarios that Contoso is interested in deploying is backing up on-premises machines to Azure, and there's roles like backup operator roles that we'll show you that as well. Again, a couple of other things is, again, these are fine-grained control. You can grant access to specific users. You can leverage groups that are on premises and they've been synchronized with Azure Active Directory, so you'll be able to leverage those. And again, this is a very simple management experience. You can use this using the Azure Portal, and that's what we'll demo this right now. But just be aware that you also have the ability to manage these permissions using command line. So if you're familiar with PowerShell, you can do that. You can log all these activities. So as you grant permissions and as folks gain access to resources, all that could be tracked and audited. And again, you can also create custom roles. So if you ever see the need of really having to create a custom role, then there's documentation that allows you to create that. All right. So let's go ahead and log in to the Azure portal and create some roles here. All right. So again, we're logged in here to the Azure portal. And this time, let's go ahead and go into the subscription, to Azure subscriptions. And again, if you have access to multiple subscriptions, you'll see that here. I'm just going to click one that I have access to right here. And the first thing we're going to do is right here underneath, right underneath overview, there's this option that says access control. And I'll click on that. And you'll be able to see existing access. So right now you'll see it, if anyone's owner access, you'll be able to see that here in the bottom side. If there's any role that's been previously granted, like a reader role, you'll be able to see that as well. So there's a column for role, and you can hover over any one of those roles and get more information. Now there's also right here at the top, there's an area for roles, and you can click on roles right here. You so choose, and you get a listing of all the different roles that are available. We talked about owner, pretty much lets you manage everything, including permissions. You got contributor, lets you manage everything except granting access, right? And then reader role, pretty self-explanatory. And then over 40 plus other roles that you can leverage. We talked about, like for example, virtual machine contributor, virtual machine administrator. They're all listed there. But again, if you have any questions as to what the roles mean and how you can leverage, right here, right next to role, there's a help icon. If you click on that, you'll be able to see this, this panel right here, which gives you more information to documentation. For example, if you wanted to know specifics about those built-in roles, you can go ahead and click on that. It's going to open up the documentation for more details on the specifics about each built-in role. So for example, you can click on owner. It'll give you more information, right? So for example, it lets you manage everything, including access to resources. So all the roles are available here with detailed information as far as the specific permissions.
And I'll just make one other note here, David, on this screen you have up at the moment, where it shows you, David Uoa, and it shows that you are an owner, but it also shows that you're a service administrator. And so just wanted to point out that that is because you are an account owner for this subscription. So if we think about Contoso Education, we assign Brian and Monica as account owners. They, by default, by being that role, become owner and service administrator. Just want to point that out.
Yeah, great point, Eric. And then the other thing we want to show you here at the subscription level, you can click the add button right there. And this is where you add the permissions. So you can select one of those existing roles that we just covered, right? And the typical top level roles are the ones most folks will be using, whether it's owner, contributor, reader. So I'm just going to pick contributor as an example. And then right here, you'll notice these are your identities that have been synchronized from your on-premises environment. So of course, this doesn't look like your particular environment, but for example, in my scenario, I can pick someone from my institution and you'll be able to just find that person. Again, this could be a group as well. Select that person and just hit save, and you'll be able to now see that person be granted the role right there at the subscription level. Now, if you ever needed to delete a role, same thing, go to the context menu right at the end, right over there, and you'll be able to take an action, or in the top right here, just choose remove, and that will go ahead and remove that role assignment. All right, so that's at the subscription level. Now, like we talked about, you can also do this at the resource group level. So now I'm going to go ahead and click on right here on the left navigation pane where it says resource groups. And we're going to cover resource groups more in detail in the next video series. But for now, I'm just going to pick a resource group. I'm going to call this, I got some existing resource groups that are provisioned. Again, resource groups are just a container. Think of it as a container that when you provision Azure resources, you assign them to a particular container. And what makes this really good is that, think of it, it could be maybe a project that has multiple Azure resources, where you create them in a resource group. If you needed to delete all the resources, you can click delete resources. But what we want to cover right now is just how to grant access. So at the resource group level, you can click access control, just like we did in the subscription. You can add, and just like we did before, you can select the role, select the person or the group, and now they have access just to this resource group. And what's really good about this is then that person or group doesn't have access at the entire subscription level. They only have access at the resource group level. So this is another way of doing this. The third way of doing this is we can actually grant access at a specific resource. So let's go back to the resource group. And let's say we just wanted to grant access to a specific resource like this one. This one happens to be what we call a recovery services vault. And a recovery services vault, think about the scenario with Contoso Education, that they wanted to back up on-premises virtual machines to Azure to leverage long-term protection. So this is that service that allows that. So now at this resource level, we can, at the same, just like we did with subscriptions, just like we did with resource groups, we have the option to just grant access at the resource level. So right here, in this case, we're going to go do the same thing, hit add, pick a role, or just grant. So right here, you would pick the role. You're actually going to see some recommended roles here. So because we are at the Recovery Services Vault, you'll notice some roles like Backup Contributor, as an example. You can select that role, and then just like we did with the other examples, we can select the particular person or group to have that role. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and let's quickly review some of the decisions. So we just reviewed how to create role-based access in Azure. Let's talk about some of the scenarios specific to Contoso. Brian, he's the account owner for the medical research. He's made some decisions now, given what we just learned. He's going to go ahead and assign permissions at the subscription level, just like we showed you, to, and again, he's got two subscriptions. He's got a production subscription and a training subscription. He's got an existing group called Research Cloud Admins that is synchronized from on-premises to Azure AD using AD Connect, and he's just going to grant that group owner access to those subscriptions. Recall we also have Monica in Contoso. She's the account owner for the central IT, and she's going to assign permissions at the subscription level to the three subscriptions that she created. She created the production subscription, Test QA Dev subscription, and a training subscription. And for her scenario, there's an existing group called Central IT Admins that she's going to grant owner access at the subscription level. So with these,
Dave, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
So, when we think about this rollout, we've got people who are going to be network focused. We're going to have people who are backup focused. When do I start thinking about those people and adding them into the role-based access control? Do I need to get all that lined up right now?
No, and this is the great thing, like we talked about at the beginning of the video series, Eric, is you don't need to have everything defined right from the beginning, right? You can have just define your owners, who are going to be the folks that have permissions to the subscription level. And then as you start rolling out resources, maybe the recovery vault for backups, maybe or for site recovery, then when you provision those resources, then you grant access to the backup operators, or maybe for a particular researcher, right? If they want to create a resource group for their project, then you define the permissions at that point. So definitely you don't have to define everything at the beginning. Everything could be fluid, right? You got folks that start a new project, so you can definitely assign those role-based access at a future time.
Great, yeah, and I think that, I do talk to my customers often, and people get a little bit concerned and worried about the appropriate way to do this. And I think the message is, just like with anything else on premises, get started with the admins, and then you can get granular as you go along. That would be much like saying I have to figure out all the file permissions assignments to every file that will eventually land in my file share, which isn't the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the key point here is everything here is audited, so you can record all the permissions. At the control plane, you have resources and services, and we cover these in other video series as far as security and management, how you can track all this. But again, just grant the top level access, create the resource groups, create the resources, and then grant permissions as your project moves along. All right, so let's now review our enrollment hierarchy for Contoso Education. So this is following the same theme that we've defined from the beginning of the series. Again, we have some enterprise enrollment level. We have Amy and David. We have departments that we've created for medical research, which Brian is the account owner, and Eric and Monica are the department and account owners for Central IT. And now at the subscription level, we have for production, for medical research, we have 2 subscriptions. We have production and training. And just like we talked about, the decisions are, there's a group called the Research Cloud Admins that are going to be made owners of those subscriptions. And then on the right-hand side for Central IT, we have 3 subscriptions. We talked about production, test, dev, QA, and training. And for that, we have another group called Central IT Admins that are going to be owners. Okay, so let's talk about next steps. So next steps is going to include Contoso learning how to use a combination now of resource groups. We have management groups, we have policies and naming conventions in conjunction with the role-based access that we just covered to improve governance. So for example, we're going to create now resources we're going to create a policy, right? To say, okay, resources are only going to be deployed within the United States. We don't want, let's say, VM administrators to deploy VMs in an Azure region that does not make sense. For example, if we're here in the United States, maybe it doesn't make sense to deploy virtual machines in Asia. There may be some exceptions, but let's say for Contoso Education, it's just not needed. And we want to make sure that we control those using policies. We're also going to create resources, like for example, a resource group for the backup team, so that when they back up resources from on premises, only the backup team has access to that resource. And then the other example we're going to cover is we're going to enforce tags. So we're going to create a policy so that we can enforce tags. And remember, in the previous video series when we covered cost management, one of the great things that you can do with cost management is create reports to leverage tags. So okay, how much are you a particular cost center is spending? How much are we spending on the development systems? If we enforce tags, then we could create better reports. So definitely stay tuned for the next video series that we're going to go ahead and cover these examples. So Thank you very much, and we're going to go ahead and move on to the next video series.